Imagine being told your life depends on saying one word correctly. In October of 1937, that was not a metaphor. On the Dominican-Haitian border, soldiers stopped people. They listened to their mouths like judges of the living and the dead, but the real horror was never the word alone. It was the regime behind it, the soldiers behind it, the border behind it. This is the story of how Rafael Trujillo turned language, race, and geography into weapons, and how one of the darkest massacres in Caribbean history was hidden inside something as ordinary as a sprig of parsley. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. They say people died over a sprig of perejil, parsley. That is the image history left hanging in the air. A soldier, a trembling mouth, one harmless kitchen herb becoming a death sentence. But parsley did not kill anyone in the Dominican Republic in October of 1937. Men killed, orders killed, a regime killed. And the real horror begins when we understand how something so ordinary was forced to carry the weight of execution. So the question is not only whether people were made to say perejil. The deeper question is how a border became so sharp, so paranoid, so hungry that one kitchen word could help decide who lived and who was cut down. How do you turn an accent into evidence, skin into suspicion, and ancestry into a target? How do you make a roadside, a doorway, and even the inside of a person's mouth part of a killing machine? That is the story hidden inside the parsley. The place was the northwestern borderlands between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. On a map, the line looked clean enough, like politicians had taken a ruler to the island and called the matter settled. But the earth had never obeyed so neatly. Around Dajabón, Monte Cristi, Santiago Rodríguez, and nearby districts, the border was less a wall than a pulse. People crossed it for trade, work, family, grazing, courtship, and simple survival. The map wanted two nations. The soil kept answering with one tangled frontier. Before the massacre, that frontier was not a frozen edge between strangers. It was a lived corridor. Farmers led animals across it. Traders carried food, cloth, tobacco, and gossip across it. Families stretched across it, with cousins, spouses, and grandparents on both sides. People spoke Spanish, Haitian Creole, and whatever mixture the day demanded. Local belonging often meant more than distant flags. Up close, this was not the clean border of schoolbooks. It was a social world woven from necessity, habit, and memory, deserving of respect for its resilience and complexity. That mattered because frontier life embarrassed the fantasies of powerful men. Dictators like clear files, clear categories, clear enemies. The borderlands offered none of that. They offered mixed communities, uncertain papers, overlapping loyalties, and people who knew the paths better than the capital slogans. To an authoritarian mind, that kind of human complexity looks like disorder, not because it is chaotic, but because it resists being reduced. And what resists being reduced is often marked as dangerous long before the first weapon appears. Rafael Trujillo came to power in 1930, and he wanted more than obedience. He wanted a nation that could be read at a glance and counted from a desk. Roads, army posts, schools, priests, officials, meant to make the frontier answer to the capital in a single voice. The borderlands, with their mixed households and flexible identities, looked illegible to him. And illegibility is one thing authoritarian power never forgives. If it cannot classify you, it begins to fear you. Now, anti-Haitianism did not begin with Trujillo. The poison was already old. Dominican elites had long built national identity against Haiti, especially through the memory of the Haitian occupation from 1822 to 1844. In that story, the Dominican Republic cast itself as Spanish, Catholic, and civilized. At the same time, Haiti was pushed into the role of Black, African, backward, and threatening. It was a nervous fable dressed as destiny, false, useful, and repeated enough times to harden into public instinct. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Even while elites painted Haitians as a contamination, the Dominican economy depended heavily on Haitian labor. Fields needed hands. Sugar needed bodies. Profits needed workers who could be used hard and paid little. So the same system that calls Haitians aliens could still treat them as indispensable, useful in the cane, disposable in the nation. That contradiction is not a side note. It is part of the engine. Exploitation and exclusion often walk together, pretending not to know each other. In the borderlands, that contradiction became impossible to hide. Haitians were not only seasonal workers drifting through, many were settlers, traders, spouses, neighbors, longtime residents, and children with roots in the soil. The massacre's aftermath reinforced racial and social divisions, leading to lasting trauma and marginalization for Haitian communities, illustrating how violence can entrench social hierarchies and racial nationalism. So when the massacre came, It was not only about killing Haitians and Haitian-descended people, it was about trying to force the frontier to confess to a purity it had never known. The regime wanted the land to line up with the myth. It wanted the map to become flesh. That is why the killings matter beyond their horror. This was not merely punishment. It was nation-making through terror, the destruction of one social world so that another, harsher one, could be imposed in its place. Look at the border before the blood, and the motive becomes clearer. Picture a market near the crossing. Roosters at people's feet, plantains stacked in uneven towers, cloth, salt, tools, beans, and rumor-changing hands. A sentence beginning in Spanish and finishing in Haitian Creole, because that is what the moment requires. A child weaving between adults who do not stop to explain what nation he belongs to before handing him a sack. That ordinary scene was the problem. It mocked official purity by simply existing. Trujillo wanted more military control, more state presence, more roads, more institutions, and more signs that the frontier answered to Santo Domingo, not to its own local logic. He wanted a border populated by recognizable Dominicans, disciplined bodies, supervised movement, and sanctioned memory. And once a regime decides that mixed life is a problem, it begins looking for a solution. Sometimes that solution wears the language of order. Sometimes it carries a machete. Often it does both and expects the world to call that governance. Then came October 2nd, 1937, in Dajabón. At a public event, Trujillo declared that he would deal with what he called the Haitian problem in the border region. Notice the trick in that phrase. First, people are stripped of names and history. Then they are recast as an issue. Then the force can arrive dressed as maintenance. By the time the weapons move, the victims have already been pushed through a grammar of removal. The blade comes late, the dehumanizing sentence comes first. From the night of October 2nd into October 3rd, the machinery began to turn. Dominican army units, local officials, and armed auxiliaries moved through the northwestern frontier. The main killing phase unfolded over the first week of October, especially from October 3rd through October 8th. Terror, pursuit, and expulsion did not end on one neat calendar square. This was not a spontaneous riot at the edge of the state. It was organized violence backed by the state and imposed upon a region the regime wanted to remake. The victims were overwhelmingly civilians, farm workers, settlers, traders, children, elders, families inside houses, people stopped on the roads, people caught near river crossings. Some were Haitian descended, some were Dominicans taken to be Haitian because they looked wrong to armed eyes, sounded wrong to armed ears, or lived in the wrong settlement. That is one of the ugliest truths here. The legal line was not the real filter. Suspicion was. And suspicion, once armed, becomes wider than any law. No honest ledger yields a single clean number for the dead. The toll remains disputed, and any voice pretending absolute certainty is selling neatness where history left trauma. But the dead were in the thousands. On that, the record does not flinch. What varies is the exact count, not the nature of the crime. The massacre happened. It was broad, it was state-directed, and it was devastating enough to alter the human geography of the frontier and scar memory on both sides of the island. How were people identified? Not by a single perfect method. That detail matters. Soldiers and collaborators used a mix of skin color, accent, language, papers, residence, ancestry, and local reputation to identify one another. Sometimes a person's neighbors knew too much. Sometimes an official knew just enough to be deadly. Sometimes the test was not legal at all, only racialized instinct backed by weapons. The state did not need a fair system. It needed the authority to decide that ordinary signs of life could suddenly count as proof of foreignness. This is where the infamous word appears. Perejil. Armed men are remembered asking suspects to say the Spanish word for parsley. If the sound came out wrong, especially the rolling of the letter R, if the accent betrayed Haitian Creole, if fear dried the mouth and tangled the tongue, that could become fatal. Imagine the scene. A soldier close enough to hear your breath, a green herb from the kitchen lifted into judgment. One word stands between a human being and the grave. Now the truth demands precision. Perejil was not the only method everywhere, and this was not some flawless machine used with perfect regularity across every village and crossing. In some places, pronunciation tests formed part of the trap. In others, people were judged by appearance, papers, residence, rumor, or plain whim, all under the cloak of official force. But the reason the Parsley story survived is that it captured the essence of the terror. The state had learned to interrogate the tongue and turn language into a weapon. And the power of that test was never in its accuracy. It was arbitrary, backed by force. Border communities were multilingual. Some Haitians spoke Spanish fluently. Some Dominicans might have stumbled under fear. Some people were spared or condemned for reasons no herb could explain. But sovereign violence does not require a reliable method of classification. It requires the authority to announce that classification is meaningful. Once that happens, the mouth itself becomes a checkpoint, and every syllable carries risk. Race worked the same way. The Dominican Republic was never a place where differences could be neatly sorted by skin color alone. Many Dominicans were dark-skinned. Many border residents were too mixed, too entangled, too human to fit the regime's fantasy. So racial ideology recruited accomplices. Accent, dress, religion, residence, paperwork, family history. A country uneasy with its own reflection can become very dangerous. It starts pointing across the river and saying, "The darkness lives over there, never here, never in the mirror, staring back." This is why the massacre cannot be reduced to blind ethnic hatred in the abstract. It was more deliberate than that, more political, more administrative. Anti-Haitianism provided the story. The state provided the structure. The army provided the force. Local officials and armed auxiliaries helped carry it out. In some places, neighbors denounced neighbors, and local participation gave the violence an intimacy that still feels unbearable. Massacres do not only descend from above, they also feed on the small betrayals waiting below. Then there were the weapons. Many victims were killed, not with loud rifle volleys, but with machetes, knives, clubs, and bayonets. Part of that choice was practical. In rural areas, close weapons are quiet and mobile, but part of it was political theater. Rifles sound official. A machete can be made to look like a local quarrel or peasant rage. The regime wanted to murder and deny at the same time. It wanted blood on the ground and plausible innocence at the desk. There is a bitter symbolism in that choice. The machete was an ordinary agricultural tool, part of field labor and survival. In that week, it crossed from work into extermination. Just as perejil moved from the kitchen to the checkpoint, the machete moved from harvest to massacre. That is how state terror often behaves. It steals the familiar objects already lying around, used in field labor and in daily life, and recruits them into violence. The ordinary is one of terror's favorite disguises, because people rarely see the blade coming while it still looks useful. The killings spread through villages, fields, roads, and river zones. Some people were pulled from homes. Others were stopped at crossings or questioned along familiar paths they had walked for years. A person could wake up in a house built by his own hands and by sundown be judged foreign in the doorway. That is the cruelty of border violence. It not only attacks the body, it attacks the accumulated proof of a life, turning home, routine, and memory into evidence against the person who lived them. Bodies were left where people fell or carried into fields and river areas where scale could blur and responsibility could hide. The Dajabón River, often called the Massacre River, hovers over this history like a witness that cannot sleep. And the violence did not end with the cutting down of human beings. Houses were emptied, livestock disappeared, goods were stolen, small holdings changed hands, blood was followed by appropriation. When a community is shattered, someone usually arrives very quickly to inherit the silence. Even where people were not killed outright, many were driven out. Survivors fled into Haiti in terror, hunger, and disbelief. So this was both mass murder and forced displacement, an attempt to reorder the border demographically as well as politically. That matters because the regime was not only punishing individual bodies, it was trying to refashion the landscape itself, to make territory and identity coincide by removing those who complicated the map. The frontier was being edited with steel, fear, and empty houses. And notice something important. The regime needed all these tests and interrogations because identity in the borderlands was not self-evident at all. If the difference between Haitian and Dominican had truly been obvious in every case, why demand words, papers, neighbors' opinions, or roadside screenings? The very need to inspect proved how artificial the regime's clean categories really were. The massacre was therefore not only a display of strength, it was also a confession of insecurity, a panicked attempt to force reality to fit ideology. That is why the famous Parsley story must be handled carefully. Popular retellings sometimes make it sound like an almost supernatural key, as if one enchanted herb sorted every living soul with cold precision. But that version, dramatic as it is, shrinks the truth. The real system was messier and therefore more frightening. Perejil was one symbol in a broader apparatus that fused speech, race, residence, ancestry, local rumor, and military power. The word mattered because a regime stood behind it with permission to kill. The aftermath exposed the same logic in a different guise. Trujillo's regime did not openly boast in the modern language of genocide. It maneuvered, it denied, it minimized. It tried to control the story while the bodies were barely cold. Violence on the ground, euphemism at the desk. The same state that could make a tongue into evidence could also try to make murder sound administrative, accidental, or exaggerated by enemies. Dictatorship often kills twice, once in the field and again in the archive. Haiti protested, and the massacre became an international issue. Under pressure, the Dominican government eventually accepted financial indemnity. Money moved, papers moved, officials performed the settlement. But compensation is not resurrection. It does not return the mother dragged from a house, the farmer stopped on a road, or the child who never crossed the river alive. It does not restore a border market to the sound it had before fear entered it. A payment may close a diplomatic file. It does not close a family wound. And massacres do not end when the killing stops. They continue in silence, caution, and inherited fear. They continue in the way families lower their voices around certain surnames, certain crossings, certain questions about where a grandparent came from. They continue in the way that a road is no longer just a road, and a checkpoint is no longer just a checkpoint. Daily life itself has been altered. That is why the Parsley story survived. It captured how terror crept into the intimate space between mouth and ear. The memory of the massacre was never held evenly. Official Dominican narratives often softened it, sidestepped it, or folded it into nationalist silence. At the same time, Haitian memory, survivor testimony, literature, and later commemoration carried the wound more openly. That unevenness is part of the event, not a footnote. States that classify bodies also try to classify remembrance. Some dead are granted a ceremony, others are pushed into the fog. Silence becomes a second border, and crossing it can take generations of stubborn testimony. Still, the border remembers what the archive tries to smooth over. The river keeps its own records. The old paths keep their own receipts. Survivors and descendants recognize something deeply true in the Parsley story, even where details varied from place to place. The truth was not that one herb explained everything. The truth was that the violence had become intimate enough to sit beside your mouth and listen. It was not only killing, it was inspecting, judging, sorting, and making those rituals feel ordinary. And that may be the darkest lesson of all. Modern states do not only rule through speeches, flags, and laws. They rule through small recognitions, through the right to ask who you are and pretend the answer can be heard in your accent, seen in your face, proven by your papers, or denied by your neighbors. In October of 1937, that logic became naked. The border was no longer merely a line between countries. It became an apparatus that could interrogate a body and condemn it. This story also matters because it refutes the lazy claim that the island was simply destined for eternal hatred. The massacre was possible precisely because coexistence had existed. Trade had existed. Mixed communities had existed. Kinship had existed. A frontier society had existed that did not mirror the capital's clean myths. Trujillo's violence was not proof that division was natural. It was proof that division had to be produced by force. The nation had to be imposed because another lived reality had already taken root. That is why the massacre should be remembered not only as an atrocity. However, it was surely one, but it was a lesson in how states draw borders by punishing ambiguity. Before the killings, the frontier was socially real but not nationally fixed in the rigid way Trujillo desired. After the killings, the fear was different. Communities were emptied. Ties were cut. Movement carried a new danger. The massacre helped harden what it claimed merely to defend. Violence creates the border. Then the power pretends the border has always been natural. And no, this was not some strange medieval episode disconnected from modern politics. It belongs to a wider history in which governments transform cultural differences into security threats and then treat entire populations as problems to be managed, expelled, or erased. What makes the Parsley Massacre so haunting is its intimacy. One word, one accent, one checkpoint, one riverbank. The machinery of racialized power became audible in a single mouthful of sound. The nation imagined it could be heard in the tongue and purified in the landscape. That fantasy should sound familiar because it never entirely disappears. The tools change, the uniforms change, the documents become more sophisticated. But the temptation remains. Sort human beings into those who belong and those who can be pushed outside protection. An accent becomes suspicious. A birthplace becomes a mark. A family name becomes a file. The lesson of 1937 is not trapped in the past. It keeps breathing whenever power decides that ordinary difference is a threat requiring extraordinary force. So when people say Parsley Massacre, we should hear both the truth and the danger in that phrase. Yes, perejil became the emblem, and symbols matter because they let memory travel. But the story must never stop there. If it does, the crime shrinks into a grotesque anecdote. The herb was not the cause. It was the miniature. Behind it stood anti-Haitian ideology, authoritarian state building, military coordination, local complicity, displacement, and a larger campaign to make a mixed frontier bow before a purified nation. Think again of the market before the killings, the stacked produce, the switching tongues. The child is moving between adults, the easy, practical intelligence of people who knew how to live at a crossroads. Then think of the same ground after the massacre. Empty stalls, missing voices, suspicion where familiarity once breathed. That is what state terror steals first. Not only life, but trust. It teaches neighbors to fear recognition, teaches language to tremble, and teaches the landscape itself to become a witness no one can comfortably face. And think of the irony. The regime claimed to defend a settled identity, yet every roadblock and every forced pronunciation revealed how unsettled that identity really was. Strong certainties do not usually need to inspect every tongue they meet. Insecure projects do. The massacre was therefore both a horrifying success of authoritarian violence and a confession of nationalist fragility. It said, in effect, that the border would no longer be lived as a conversation. It would be enforced as a verdict. The dead deserve more than to be trapped inside one shocking anecdote. They were not symbols first. They were people with kitchens, debts, courtships, harvests, aches, songs, and plans for the next week. Women and children were among them. Elders were among them. Traders, settlers, laborers, and longtime residents were among them. To remember them responsibly is to keep the symbol and the humanity together. Perejil matters because it condenses the terror. The people matter because they were the ones forced to carry it. So let us return to the opening question. Did people die because they could not say a word the right way? In some places, that cruel demand was part of the trap, yes. But the deeper truth is darker. People died because a regime decided that accent, ancestry, skin, residence, and rumor could all be converted into evidence of non-belonging. They died because anti-Haitian nationalism was armed with state power. They died because a porous frontier was being remade into a fearful national border through blood. And the sprig of parsley remains, green and small, almost offensively innocent. It returns like a refrain because history sometimes hides its sharpest teeth inside quiet objects. A leaf in the kitchen, a word in the mouth, a blade in the field, a body by the river. The Parsley Massacre endures not because the symbol is strange, but because the mechanism is terrifyingly familiar. Ordinary life can be weaponized with frightening ease once power decides that a difference, however small, deserves punishment. If one thought should follow you into the dark, let it be this. The most dangerous borders are not always the lines drawn on maps. Sometimes the deadliest border is the one a regime forces between human beings through fear, myth, and the policing of everyday signs. In October of 1937, the Dominican-Haitian frontier learned that lesson in blood. The river remembers. The land remembers. The families remember. Tell me in the comments which detail stays with you most. The word, the river, the theft, or the silence after. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.